It's almost about that time, right about now.
Right about now. Funk, bunk, 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 soul brother.
Hey everybody, welcome to the Right About Now podcast. This is John Small. My guest today is Saul Austerlitz. And Saul has written a new book called Kind of a Big Deal: How Anchorman Stayed Classy and Became the Most Iconic Comedy of the 21st Century. I love this movie, Anchorman, and Saul's book coincides with the 20th anniversary of the film. God, has it really been 20 years? Isn't that incredible? I remember being in the theater watching that movie for the first time. In the book, Saul tells the inside story of how Anchorman came to be, how it was written and cast, and ultimately how it launched the careers of people you may have heard of, like Will Ferrell and Steve Carell and Paul Rudd. The movie was the first, and I would say probably the best, of a slew of comedies that came out in the early 2000s. Movies like The 40-Year-Old Version, Talladega Nights, Knocked Up, Step Brothers, Superbad, and so many more. But Austerlitz argues that it wasn't just a really funny movie, but it was also a interesting and sly commentary on feminism, on the media, on male toxicity, on 1970s nostalgia. He believes this movie is so important that every year he screens it for his students at NYU's Gallatin School, where he teaches a course on writing and comedy history. I loved reading about Anchorman, and when I found out that this book was coming out, I was so excited because it gave me an excuse to rewatch the movie with my kids. And let me tell you something, it really holds up. It is still funny, even funnier than I remember it being. I learned so much talking to Saul. You won't believe the backstory of this movie. It's crazy. So without further ado, I bring you my conversation with Saul Austerlitz.
Thinking of he's working up my appetite. Looking forward to a little afternoon delight. Rubbing sticks and stones together make a spark ignite. And the thought of loving you is getting so...
Saul Austerlitz, welcome to the Right About Now podcast.
Thanks so much for having me.
Before we get started talking about Anchorman, one of my favorite movies, I wanted to get a little, snapshot of your writing origin story, kind of how you got into writing. Tell us a little bit about how it all got started for you.
Yeah, I always loved writing. I always loved reading. I think I got particularly interested in film criticism and arts criticism when I was a teenager. I would read the Los Angeles Times religiously, the calendar section every day. I started paying attention to, which critics I liked and whose voices I admired. And I started doing some of my own writing. When I was in college, I started writing for some film magazines.
Where'd you go to college?
I went to Yale.
I've heard of that.
Yeah. I started writing for film magazines like CinemaScope and Cineast. They didn't pay any money, but they were willing to publish my work, which was pretty amazing in its own right when I was, 20 and 21 years old. And that was just a great experience for me in terms of kind of understanding how to do it and starting the long process of figuring out what I wanted my voice to sound like on the page. And then after I finished school, I started freelancing and writing for different publications, including The Forward, the New York Press, which no longer exists, but was sort of like an alternative to the Village Voice.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it was just a great experience. It was hard, hard to make a living as a freelance writer.
Yeah, especially I know you're younger than I am. So yeah, I think when you came up, it's even harder.
And it seems like it gets harder and harder with each year.
The amount you can make per word just goes down every year, depreciates.
Exactly. But it was still a wonderful experience to sort of learn how to write for different audiences and start to understand how I want it to sound.
That's wonderful. So you managed to be a freelance writer, but I guess, were you able to make a living and kind of put food on the table doing that, or did you have to do other things on the side?
At the beginning, I definitely did other things as well. I took sort of part-time-ish corporate jobs that helped pay the bills. I've done ghostwriting and other stuff like that. I would say it took quite a few years to get to the point where I felt like I could just earn a living from writing. And now I teach as well, which I guess is its own separate thing, but kind
Yeah.
of feels like part and parcel of the work of being a writer is teaching writing also.
That's really cool. And you teach at Gallatin. What do you teach at Gallatin?
So I teach two writing courses there. I teach one class called Writing About American Comedy, which I write about in the book.
Mm-hmm.
Because it's the place where I show my students Anchorman. And I teach a class called Writing About Television Drama. So they're both writing workshops where students write 3 essays over the course of the semester. And, the class helps workshop them and provide notes and feedback on their first drafts. And then also we spend some time kind of working through the history of the medium that we're looking at. So American comedy history for the American comedy class and looking at television shows of the last 25 years or so for the television drama class.
I want to take those courses. That's the thing about college. You go to college too young. Like now I know exactly what kind of classes I'd want to take. And that's one. Like I would love to take classes writing about like pop culture and classic, films and television shows. I want to talk about Anchorman. I'm excited to talk about Anchorman. Maybe we should set up for the 3 people listening to this who may have never seen the movie. What's the kind of like a brief summary of the plot?
So Anchorman is a 2004 comedy written by Will Ferrell and Adam McKay and directed by Adam McKay. It is set in the world of 1970s local television newscasters.
There was a time before cable, when the local anchorman reigned supreme. When people believed everything they heard on TV. This was an age when only men were allowed to read the news. And in San Diego, one anchorman was more man than the rest. His name was Ron Burgundy.
And it's about what happens at a seemingly successful San Diego local news station when a woman is brought into this hothouse world of male newscasters and starts reporting the news as well.
Ron Burgundy was the balls.
I look good. I mean, really good.
So you mentioned that you show this movie to your class every year. This is your class on writing about American comedy.
Yes.
Tell us why. It just seems like kind of a funny movie to show. Why this movie?
It for sure is, and I'm kind of leaning into that. I am looking to push back a bit against what I think is an unconscious assumption that my students often have, and that I know that the culture at large has, which is that comedy is second rate and disposable and not really entirely worthy of extended critical attention. Comedies aren't really the movies that get the awards nominations. They aren't usually the movies that get the thoughtful extended reviews in the newspaper or online. And I think that's a mistake on both fronts. So I show Anchorman in part to get students to have that response of, wait, why are we watching this movie?
Right.
Why is the professor showing us this dumbass movie? And my goal is to help them kind of think through all the different ways that they might approach the movie, all the different critical tools that they might use to look at it, whether it's thinking about the movie as part of the legacy of Saturday Night Live, whether it's thinking about the careers of Will Ferrell or Adam McKay, whether it's thinking about the ways in which the movie approaches the 1970s or feminism or television news, and just beginning the process of realizing that even this movie, and again, I've chosen this movie, so I've carefully planted it, but even this movie that you might think of as being disposable has all of these different ways that you might write about it and think about it that could be illuminating. So that's sort of the goal that I have.
No, then that makes a lot of sense to me. You put it in your book, you put it in the context of a lot of the movies that came before and after this movie that might be considered similar. Movies like Superbad and Pineapple Express and the 40-Year-Old Virgin, this era of movies, Step Brothers, Old School, some of the movies that even had the same actors and same writers. But you singled out this particular movie. Why? What is it about this movie that warrants, this much focus?
Yeah, I mean, I was definitely interested in the whole era, and I do write about most, if not all, of the movies that you mentioned, and think that they're interesting as part of this larger landscape, and especially of what now feels like a kind of bygone era in film comedy, right? We just don't have these kinds of movies being made anymore. We don't really have comedies in general being made to the same extent, which I think is sad, and maybe we'll talk about in a bit.
Yeah.
But I think I selected Anchorman because I do see all of the depths that the movie has and the ways in which it is this really stinging satire of misogyny and male stupidity that's couched in the context of this exceptionally funny and broad and sometimes silly movie. And I think that contradiction is part of what attracted me to it. And I just think one of the interesting things for me as a cultural critic is letting time pass and seeing what sticks around and what doesn't. So I don't know, when I saw Anchorman in the theaters in 2004 and I loved it and thought it was hilarious, I don't know if I necessarily would have known at that moment that this movie would continue to be a movie that people connected with almost 20 years later. And so it's fascinating to me to sort of see which movies stick around, which are ones that people still find compelling or funny or exciting, and which ones don't. And Anchorman has passed that test, at least so far.
Do you know who I am?
No, I can't say that I do.
I don't know how to put this, but I'm kind of a big deal.
Really?
People know me.
Well, I'm very happy for you.
I'm very important. I have many leather-bound books, and my apartment smells of rich mahogany.
Yeah, I'm always, we always say, oh, it doesn't age well, And this sort of interesting experiment that I always do is when I showed some of these movies to my kids who are now 13 and 17, these movies that I loved as a kid. Of course, Anchorman, I didn't see as a kid. I saw it more in my 20s. But the idea, does it age well? That movie does not work now. The movies like, Fast Times at Ridgemont High, some of the Breakfast Club, some of the John Hughes movies don't always age as well. They feel pretty dated. And mainly they feel very inappropriate. Like we were watching Revenge of the Nerds the other day with my son, and there's like a rape scene in that movie that was like considered funny at the time, So it's really weird how comedy changes over the years and how things just don't age. But this movie does age well, at least in your opinion. And I think it does too. By the way, I went back and watched it last week. Thank goodness I had an excuse to show it to my kids. And they did not have like an averse, like they're always like, oh my God, that's so inappropriate. They'll say things like that sometimes. But I'm curious when you show it, especially, we read so much about in classrooms today, how there's, the woke culture, how, today's youth responds to that movie. Do some people get offended by Anchorman? Like there's definitely some scenes when, watching it with that lens, I noticed there's some scenes that might not sit very well with like an audience in 2024.
Yeah, I think that there are definitely aspects of the movie that haven't aged quite as well. I think that the movie is very careful and very precise in thinking about the ways in which its male characters are misogynistic. And all of the jokes are very carefully calibrated so that while they're funny, Veronica Corningstone always kind of gets the last word and the last laugh in each of those scenarios. I think there are places here where there's kind of jokes about homosexuality that aren't as carefully wrought. And I think those don't land quite as well for me. So I think that to me is the place where the movie kind of has the most ground to make up, or the most space where it's not quite working as well as it did.
Yeah. There's also Ben Stiller's appearance, I thought was like, okay, that would definitely not fly today, because he sort of makes a cameo as a Latino newscaster with an accent. They definitely would not have cast Ben Stiller in that role today.
No, there's no question about that. That segment, the whole larger segment is extremely funny, but that particular moment kind of lands with a thud, primarily as a casting choice more than anything else.
But I'm curious, so that's what we think. We're old fuddy-duddies. You're not old, but whatever, you know what I mean. What do your students think?
It's a mix. I think this will make us feel old, but many of my students, especially as time passes, are not familiar with Anchorman at all. And some of them are now, were basically born when Anchorman came out.
Yeah, crazy.
So that definitely has changed it somewhat. When I first started showing it, I think students were a bit more familiar with it, had already seen it in large part. And as time passes, that's less the case. I would say that, again, I only have my own particular experience, but in my experience, my students are always pretty open to seeing things that might not be 100% to their liking, or might kind of challenge some of their assumptions, or might offend them in some ways. And I think part of what we talk about is that comedy does offend sometimes, right? There are ways in which comedy kind of triggers our dissatisfaction or makes us unhappy in some ways. And that comedy is so tied to a particular time and place that sometimes jokes that are wildly funny in one moment are less so in another moment. But I think also it works a little bit in the other direction as well. One of the things that I took note of, again, just through this happenstance of watching Anchorman year after year as part of my class, is that things happen in the world and you suddenly see the movie in a somewhat different light. So one of the realizations that I had, especially, after the MeToo movement got started, is that Anchorman is really a MeToo movie, right? Before we had the concept or the word, it's very much a movie about a rampant pattern of male misbehavior and harassment in the workplace, and about how one particular woman handles that situation. And, I think there's interesting things to be said about the ways in which Anchorman specifically and intentionally frames itself as taking place in the bad old days, right? It's a 2004 movie that's set in the 1970s. It's set in another time and place. But I think the movie has a lot of really smart things to say about what it's like to experience that, and what it's like to be the insensitive jerk who is propagating that behavior also.
Yeah. Do you think it's a feminist movie?
I do, actually. Yeah, I think that, to me, one of the key takeaways in looking at it again was the ways in which this movie is really Veronica Corningstone's story, and the ways in which the movie is interested in telling a story about, what it's like to be a woman in a kind of hostile workplace, in a workplace that's not receptive to your presence at all. And kind of interested in engaging with that story and understanding it from the inside. So yeah, I think very much so. I think especially as we look at the remainder of Will Ferrell and Adam McKay's work, they're always very interested in kind of what are men doing when they're left to their own devices. And
good things.
It's a source of their comedy. It's also often a source of the tension in their movies. And Anchorman in particular is interested in like you're saying, in this kind of toxic masculinity and what happens when it runs fully amok.
Right About Now is brought to you by AG1 by Athletic Greens. I am a big fan of AG1 by Athletic Greens. I drink it twice a day. I mix it with some coconut water and some filtered water and find that it really helps with my digestion, helps with my energy level, just helps me feel healthy and helps me get in some much needed vitamins that I might be missing in my regular diet. I totally recommend this product. And if you're looking for an easier way to take supplements, Athletic Greens is actually giving you a free 1-year supply of vitamin D and 5 free travel packs with your first purchase. I've got a special deal with Athletic Greens. All you have to do is go to Athletic Greens /Right About Now. That's WRITE About Now. And enjoy. Let's talk a little bit about the genesis of this movie and how it all happened and what almost happened instead. I learned so much reading your book, so I didn't realize, probably should have realized, that Will Ferrell met Adam McKay at Saturday Night Live. Will was obviously a great cast member, and Adam was a writer at the time, was the head writer for a while. Mm-hmm. So they met at Saturday Night Live. So obviously this movie has a lot of the sensibilities of Saturday Night Live. But tell us how they originally came up with the concept for the movie.
So, like you said, Will Ferrell and Adam McKay met at SNL and they started to work on sketches together because they realized they had shared sensibilities. Adam McKay came from the world of Chicago sketch and improv, and it was often very intellectual and experimental. And Will Ferrell came from the Groundlings in Los Angeles, which also was very smart comedy, but was often a bit more character driven. So they really kind of combined together in a way that worked really well for the strictures of SNL and what SNL was looking for. And they found that they wrote well together. So after a number of years working on SNL, they started talking about, well, should we think about maybe writing a movie script together? And they came up with an idea called August Blowout, which was about used car salesmen in Anaheim, California, home of Disneyland.
Yeah.
And by all, it's a very funny script and people really responded well to it and really liked it. But in terms of the industry, there were two problems. One was that McKay wasn't really a known commodity in the world of film, and Will Ferrell wasn't really a movie star. And so the idea of a movie starring this guy from SNL that people liked, but who hadn't really been in many movies, felt questionable. So the script went around the whole industry, got a lot of positive feedback. At one point, they brought in Tina Fey to do a punch up on the script, which McKay and Ferrell were really happy with and felt like it made the script even better. But ultimately, no one wanted to buy it. And they felt really despondent and kind of beaten down by the whole process. And they weren't sure if they wanted to give it another shot or just say, we gave it our best and this didn't work out. Ultimately, they decided to give it another try. And Ferrell was home watching TV one evening and he was flipping channels and came across an A&E biography about the 1970s television newscaster Jessica Savage. And the person on screen was one of Savage's fellow news anchors, a man named Mort Krim. And he was talking very offhandedly and casually about how, well, it was the 1970s and us male newsmen, we were all a bunch of male chauvinist pigs.
Yeah.
A little light bulb went off in Ferrell's head saying, this is something we can maybe work with. They both had been interested in local news. McKay had grown up in the Philadelphia area and had sort of very fond memories of Philadelphia newscasters. And it just so happened that as they were having this idea, Paul Thomas Anderson, the director of Boogie Nights, was at SNL that week. He was very interested in how Saturday Night Live worked and had kind of wangled an invitation to spend some time with the writers there and learn about the process. And they shared the idea with Paul Thomas Anderson, and he said, oh, this sounds great. Why don't you all go to Philadelphia and sort of talk to some newscasters there and write a script and, maybe I'll produce the movie. So they did all that. They wrote a script, and the first draft of the script ended up being about a team of newscasters, including a Ron Burgundy-esque character, who are flying to Philadelphia for a newscasters convention, and the plane crashes on the way there, and the survivors end up engaging in cannibalism to survive. And while all of this is happening, there are orangutans with ninja throwing stars who are picking off the surviving newsmen one by one. So a little bit different from
just a little different, but kind of brilliant, and kind of want to see that movie really badly.
100% I would go see that movie.
Yeah.
So they show it to Paul Thomas Anderson and he basically says,
thanks.
I don't know what to do with this. I'm not really sure how I can help you. And maybe I don't actually know how to produce a movie, and ends up not producing anyone else's movies for 20 years to come. So
they were in good company with that one. So that's hilarious. So that movie, which sounds brilliant as a concept, doesn't really go too far though. Like Paul Thomas Anderson isn't the only person that passes on it.
Yeah, it doesn't really go much of anywhere. And they end up being connected with Judd Apatow, who at the time, was known for Freaks and Geeks and Undeclared and hadn't really started directing his own movies yet. And he's brought in as a kind of writing consultant guru. And he encourages them in two sort of equal and opposite directions. The first is he tells them, guys, this is great. You've written a Monty Python film. You're not Monty Python. So, let's develop this in a way where we have more characters and more of a reason to care about anything that's happening here. Like, what's the reason that we're watching this? And the second thing he tells them, which is sort of the opposite of it, is he says, there are places here where you've sketched out what could be a funny idea. Like you've written something here about having a West Side Story-esque showdown between rival news teams. Let's take that to the fullest. Like, what does that look like? What is that scene actually going to be like if you were able to make it? So with his guidance, they end up coming back with a version of the script that's a bit more like what we know, although with some notable changes. And even still, and again, they get very positive responses. People really like the script, think it's really funny. One day they're asked to come into a studio called New Regency and do script reading, where they bring in actors to perform the script. And people are laughing so hard and, really enjoying it. And one of the executives from New Regency comes over to Adam McKay afterwards and says, that was so terrific. What a wonderful way to start our Monday morning. I can't thank you enough. This was just terrific. And Adam McKay, maybe not entirely understanding the ways of Hollywood just yet, says, oh, great. So do you think you'd be interested in making the movie? And the executive looks at him like taken aback by the question and says, no, of course not. We could never make this movie.
So Hollywood. Oh, my God.
And that's
nobody knows anything. Yeah.
That's the general vibe that they get. They get something like 37 rejections over the course of 2 days for this script. And so again, they're feeling, burned out and like they don't quite get how they can get over the hump. And the thing that ends up changing it is Old School. Will Ferrell gets cast in Old School. I think we all sort of now remember Old School as a Will Ferrell movie that he stars in. But he's actually, he's like the third billed actor and is playing more of a supporting role.
Like Luke Wilson was like the main guy in that movie. Yeah,
exactly. Luke Wilson, Vince Vaughn. It's funny. We sort of remember.
We only remember the scene where he gets shot with the dart. At least that's the one I always remember. Or when he's streaking.
Exactly. Or the rhythmic gymnastics.
Yeah, exactly.
So Old School becomes a really big hit in the spring of 2003, somewhat unexpectedly. And Will Ferrell is the person that audiences most connect with in the film. And so everyone suddenly wants to be in the Will Ferrell business, and they realize that Will Ferrell is, a budding movie star. And Anchorman, by virtue of being a script that already exists and that's already sort of in the orbit of the studios, becomes a relatively hot commodity and gets greenlit in fairly short order after Old School.
And it's so interesting. So the casting, and talking about casting, and it's always fun to listen to who they originally had in mind for these parts and who ends up getting the part. So talk about some of the people who either turned the movie down or who they wanted that they couldn't get.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So originally with the script, they had a kind of cast list, but I think it was more along the lines of dream casting.
Yeah,
right?
like a wish list. Yeah.
Who do we picture in these roles more than specific? So, they always knew that Will Ferrell was going to play Ron Burgundy. For the role of Brian Fantana, they had suggested Ben Stiller, but I think in the time between, jotting his name down and actually being able to start casting the movie, Ben Stiller had been in movies like Meet the Parents and Zoolander and had become a giant movie star. And so was not likely to take a supporting role in somebody else's relatively untested movie. So for Brian, they ended up coming down to 2 finalists. They were looking at Bob Odenkirk, which is sort of fascinating to me. We now think of him as the guy from Breaking Bad and Better Call Saul, but in that moment, he was much more of a sketch comedy person, right? People knew him from Mr. Show. And given that McKay in particular was really committed to the idea of improvisation and of letting actors kind of figure out their roles and try out different lines, it sort of would have made sense to cast Odenkirk as someone who's, clearly a master of that kind of performance. And at the same time, they were hearing a lot from Paul Rudd, and Paul Rudd, had already been in Wet Hot American Summer, but was someone that audiences mostly knew from Clueless or from the kinds of like romantic comedies that he had been kind of miscast in a little bit prior to that. And McKay described Paul Rudd as being thirsty for the role, that he would, even before the script had been greenlit, he would call and say, what's the latest with the script? I really love it. I'd love to be in it. And they'd be like, Paul, we don't no one's making the movie yet.
Right.
And I think they ended up liking two things in particular about Rudd. One was that they were a little bit pleasantly surprised to see his comedic abilities, that he was able to improvise and to kind of experiment with the script in a way that they had hoped for. And the second was that they thought that Rudd had that kind of leading man quality that might add a little bit to the nuance of the role and a little bit to the humor of the role. And so they ended up going with Rudd by like an eyelash over Bob Odenkirk.
So interesting to imagine Bob Odenkirk in that role. I mean, you know, everything seems to work out because Paul Rudd just seems like such a natural. The part of Steve Carell, so it's hard to believe now, you know, when they were casting that movie, Steve Carell wasn't a big star yet. He was kind of like a guy that was on The Daily Show and was popular from his improv day. Everybody knew him as being a great improver. So how did he get the role?
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. Steve Carell was not a particularly known commodity, right? People who watch The Daily Show would know who he is, but he wasn't someone who'd been in a lot of movies. He came in and auditioned for the role and really impressed McKay and Ferrell. McKay had worked with him somewhat in the past. They had overlapped a bit at Second City in Chicago. McKay had been at Second City with Steve Carell's wife, Nancy Walls. There had been one performance where McKay and Nancy Walls were on stage, and Steve Carell was sort of the ringer in the audience, where the audience didn't know that he was in on it, and they were sort of harassing him until he burst into tears and left. Yeah, so they knew Steve Carell. The sort of interesting thing that happened over the course of the casting for that role was that out of the blue, James Spader ended up calling them and saying, "Hey, I read the script and I love it, and I want to play Brick Tamland." And, you know, James Spader at the time was known for stuff like Sex, Lies, and Videotape and The Practice. Right. And so they're sort of like, really, this role? You want to play this role?
This guy, yeah.
And they felt like this is such an amazing opportunity that an actor like James Spader would want to be in our movie, but also we kind of need to see you do it just to know what we're getting into. And so they asked him, you know, we'd love to have you come in and audition for the role. And James Spader, you know, somewhat understandably, given the way that Hollywood works, was like, I don't audition at this point anymore. And so they decided we can't hire James Spader without sort of having a sense of what it'll look like. But again, just kind of fascinating to consider the what ifs.
And also the fact that James Spader would then go on to replace Michael Scott on The Office is like, exactly. It's just funny, like the sort of like way it all circles around. I had an experience. I interviewed Steve Carell when he was on The Office, and I went to the set, and it was really a weird story. It was in the early days of The Office, and we were doing a fashion story about The Office for Maxim magazine. And I asked him some fashion questions. He said, "Well, do you want me to do it in character? I'll do it. I can do it as Michael Scott. I can answer these questions as Michael Scott." And I asked him some fashion question, and his answer was so funny. I don't think I've ever laughed harder in my life. And I've looked like for years for this tape just to play it back, because I remember playing it for me and my wife. After I came home, I said, "You got to hear what he said." He is such a good improver. Like, he is one of the funniest people I've ever met, because he does everything so deadpan. And it was just, it was brilliant. Just watching it a second time, his interpretation of that part and how he does that. I mean, he does so little, but gets so much out of what he says. Like, it's really hard to do what he does.
It is. And I think one of the things that McKay realized over the course of shooting the film, and then even more so over the course of editing it, was that they could kind of stick Steve Carell in anywhere, like in any scene,
do anything,
something he had done. It didn't necessarily have to connect with anything that anyone else was doing, and it would make every scene better. So that's a pretty magical combination to have as a director or as an editor.
Yeah. Let's talk about the improv, because you mentioned that Adam McKay is a big proponent of improv, came up in the improv world. And I was interested to read that there was a big emphasis put on improv in this movie, that they had the script, but the actors were also encouraged to do takes where they would just improv. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. So, I think it's helpful to acknowledge that in the moment, the idea of doing improvisation on a feature film set was like the epitome of what you didn't do, right? There was stuff like Christopher Guest, but for the most part, leaving the cameras running while you let actors try to figure out what they were going to say in a given scene was the literal embodiment of setting your money on fire and no one would suggest doing it. McKay, having come from Chicago and having come from SNL, had really crafted a style that felt comfortable to him. And it was really important to him to bring in actors who knew how to do it and also give them the space and the energy to do it. So once they had cast all the major roles, the first communication that McKay had with the actors was to say, this is what we're thinking about doing. We're thinking about having film set where everyone is comfortable improvising and where I'm going to ask people to improvise. And sometimes that will be you, the actor, trying out different lines or strategies that you've come up with. And sometimes also I may just shout out lines for somebody to try. Like, does that sound okay for you? And so everyone was agreeable to that. And then I think the key thing that McKay did was communicate to everyone on set that this was going to have to be sort of a comfortable space for the actors, right? Because in normal circumstances, the idea that an actor would kind of comment on other actors' performances or say, hey, why don't you try this instead of that? You would never do that, right? It would be humiliating. It would be, everyone would hate you. It's not how acting works. And here, part of what McKay wanted was he wanted that kind of collaborative SNL-esque aspect of the work where people could say, oh, I really like this. Why don't you also say that? And so one example that I came across that I really enjoyed was I spoke to David Koechner, and he was telling me about the sequence where Ron and the News Channel 4 team first encounter their rivals, including Vince Vaughn, in the park. And Champ is supposed to say something to Vince Vaughn's character, Wes Mantooth, that kind of riles him up. So David Koechner came up with a line where he said something along the lines of, I'm going to take your mother, Dorothy Mantooth, out for dinner and never call her again. Mm-hmm. And everyone felt like, okay, that's really good, like really nice. But Koechner was like, I feel like there's maybe something else I can add here. And he pulled Steve Carell over and said, do you have any suggestions? Like, what do you think about this moment? And Steve Carell thought about it and said,
I will smash your face into a car windshield and then take your mother, Dorothy Mantooth, out for a nice seafood dinner and never call her again.
And that was the line they ended up using. And Koechner, who was born and raised in Missouri, said, I would never have come up with the specifics of the seafood dinner,
right?
Being from middle America like that. And so I just love that as a kind of representation of the ways in which the actors felt comfortable kind of sharing the burden and helping each other figure out the best version of their roles. And I think that part of it also was McKay communicating with the crew in particular and making it clear that this was going to be a space where everyone was going to stay calm and where everyone was going to be polite to each other, right? That lots of other crew members had worked on sets that were run by tyrants who were, shouting and rude. And McKay didn't do that and didn't let anyone else do that. And the way that he put it, he was sort of, he's referencing Francis Ford Coppola's Apocalypse Now and was saying, we're not in the Philippines. We're not millions of dollars over budget. I haven't had a heart attack. Like, as long as those things aren't happening, like everyone needs to stay calm. And I think that attitude allowed the actors to try out this scary thing, right? Because the most brilliant improviser is going to sometimes say something that's not funny. And so you need to feel comfortable enough that to throw out those clunkers.
You have to do a lot of yes ands. For somebody who's done some improv classes, I know that yes and is you never, when you're doing improv, you say yes and you build on it, right?
Exactly.
What are some kind of famous or notable scenes that were improv? You mentioned the seafood one, but what is something that somebody just kind of came up with in the flash?
So I think that's a good example of one. I think the newsroom showdown, right? The anchor showdown has some improvised sequences, although there had to be a little bit more pre-planning just because it's a sequence where, like an action movie breaks out in the middle of a comedy.
That's the one scene. It's this movie's completely unrealistic, but that scene is so over the top that it's like, oh, it kind of surprised me a little bit seeing it the second time or whatever, the fifth time I've seen that movie, right? Like you have people getting their arms chopped off and, a guy's set on fire. And, it's interesting that they would choose to go so over the top in that scene. I thought.
Yeah, I think they decided that that scene was going to be sort of the most over the top sequence. And
Yeah.
so McKay told himself, like, the one thing I really want in this scene is I need to have a man on fire just kind of walking unnecessarily through the scene as people are fighting.
Yeah,
And so
that's
it's
very
kind
funny.
of set the tone for what they were looking for.
Yeah. All right. There's one. Chuck D was at one time in this movie. Chuck D from Public Enemy. So there's a whole major sort of plot that is taken out of the original version. Tell me a little bit about that.
Yeah, so when we get to production, the script is still notably different from what we would end up seeing on the screen. There was an entire subplot, although it was a pretty crucial part of the story, about Ron and the News Channel 4 team taking on a group called the Alarm Clock, which was like a vaguely countercultural, radical group.
Right.
And Chuck D was among them, and also Maya Rudolph and Kevin Corrigan. And they shot all of the scenes, and it was like 40 or 45 minutes of the movie. And they end up going, they have an advanced screening for audiences in LA and Westwood. And McKay and Ferrell are there, and the audience is laughing really hard, and it seems like it's going great. They're supposed to get kind of test scores back, and usually if the scores are over 70, you feel like, okay, we're on the right track, things are going well. And they get the scores back, and the scores are around 50 instead.
Mm.
So they're shocked and can't believe it and feel really taken aback. And McKay goes over to one of the DreamWorks executives and says, what's going on here? And the executive turns to him and says, "You idiot, you killed the dog." So one of the problems was that in this version, Baxter actually dies. And the audience apparently really didn't like that because they never.
That scene, I'm glad that Baxter comes back, but that scene shocked me. We'll talk about that in a minute. But anyway, so that was something that they had to change.
So that was the first thing. And then once they kind of opened up the hood and started looking, they realized a clever thing that the editor of the film, Brent White, had done was that he set up a recorder to record the audience response during the screening. So he could then play it back and see in kind of real audio time what the audience was and wasn't responding to. And it was clear that all of the alarm clock sequences were dragging the movie down a little bit. They were fun, but they weren't necessary. So they ultimately decided to reshoot, and they cut out all of the alarm clock segments and instead, brought Baxter back and had the whole finale at the zoo where Ron saves Veronica. And the interesting thing that ended up happening was that Brent White, the editor, realized, okay, we have like 40 minutes of fully shot, fully edited footage of all these alarm clock sequences. It would be great to get them out there in some fashion because it's kind of like a movie.
Yeah.
And so rather than just sticking them together as a bunch of deleted scenes, he set himself the challenge of how can I make something resembling a movie out of this and the other leftovers from the Anchorman shoot. And, they asked for extra money and didn't get any. So he just worked with whatever he had. And so ended up making this DVD extra that's really like a whole second movie called Wake Up, Ron Burgundy.
Oh, wow. I didn't realize. Okay.
It contains all of the alarm clock sequences. It sort of feels like if you're watching it and, you have like one eye on your phone,
yeah,
you're kind of half watching it, you may feel like you watched Anchorman, but it very much is its own thing and has no overlap with Anchorman as it was released theatrically. So it's just kind of a fascinating experimental comedic take. It's not nearly as good as Anchorman, but it's fascinating to look at. And
yeah, that's really interesting. Did they have to add? So they do have this rivalry with like the Channel 4 team or something. Was that something they added later? Or did they have two rivalries? They had the rivalry with the alarm clock and a rivalry with Channel 4.
Yeah, they still had the rival news teams were in the earlier version as well.
Okay.
The alarm clock was more like they kidnapped Veronica. They sort of are trying to figure out what exactly they're radicalized about because they don't really know.
Oh, interesting.
At the end, the head of the alarm clock proposes that the major change to society he'd like to see is that people start to recycle. And Ron responds to him like, "Oh, you're a maniac." So, 70s kind of jokes.
Let's talk about the dog. So for those who don't remember this, so Ron has this dog, Baxter. Ron has this dog, Baxter. He's very, very close to Baxter. And Baxter doesn't really like women, and Ron, Baxter's a jealous dog. But anyway, in one scene in the movie, Ron gets into a traffic accident with a character played by Jack Black, like who's on a motorcycle, and Jack Black gets so angry at Ron that he takes his dog and kicks him off a bridge into the water.
Right here. You destroyed the only thing I love. All right, there it is. What do you love?
I love poetry, and a glass of scotch, and of course, my friend Baxter here.
Well, guess what? Now this is happening.
Excuse me. Excuse me. What are you doing?
That's how I roll.
Baxter. Huh? No!
And it just sends Ron completely spiraling into and the scene is kind of shocking because like you never see violence against animals in movies anymore, ever, unless it's like that's the point of it, like to show how horrible it is. So it's kind of a little shocking, but they, like you said, in one of the test screenings, people were like, you can't kill a dog. Like that's never funny. But tell me like a little bit what they did to kind of make it, to soften the blow a bit.
Yeah, so I think they did two things to soften that blow. One is the change in the ending where, Veronica and then Ron fall into a bear pit at the zoo, and Baxter ends up coming back and rescuing them.
So he becomes a hero from the dead dog to the hero dog.
Exactly. And there's a very funny sequence where he sort of, he barks at the bear, and we see subtitles showing us what he says, and that's how he rescues them. And the other thing is that, when you go and look at the sequence where Baxter gets punted off the bridge, they make it very clear, like you can easily tell that it's a stuffed animal that's being kicked in that moment. And so I think it reduces the realism there, as much as we care about realism in a movie like Anchorman, but I think it assuages any audience concerns that anything bad is actually happening in the moment.
Let's talk about the process of writing this book for a minute. So I saw in the, I guess in the index that you interviewed a lot of the major players, right? Like how many people did you interview to write this book?
I did about 60 interviews for this book. Yeah, I interviewed a whole bunch of the crew members, and that was always fascinating. And I got terrific material from people like the costume designer, Deborah McGuire, the cinematographer, Tom Ackerman, the set decorator, Jan Pascale, who would go on to win an Oscar for movies like Mank. And they had just fascinating things to say, both in terms of what their process was like of figuring out their specific work, and also just being on set and watching what happened and being a part of it. And then I also got to speak to David Koechner and Will Ferrell and Adam McKay, and it was just fascinating. Especially for me, it was especially fascinating to learn about Ferrell and McKay as writers, right? I think we don't always think of Will Ferrell as a comedy writer, which is a shame because he's written some of the great comedies of the last 20 years. So learning a bit more about how they wrote together and what it was like for them to write together and why they were drawn to write together as part.
What did you learn? Like who did they riff? Like what's their process?
Yeah, so they came up with an idea that they called the big messy bag of ideas. And what they would do is say, okay, all we're doing right now is we're just coming up with ideas. Like they don't have to be connected to anything. They don't have to make sense. They don't have to like match up with each other. We're just throwing a bunch of ideas out there, like characteristics of characters or funny things that might happen. And then we'll use those. So that would be kind of the first step. Usually Ferrell was the one who would sit at the keyboard typing things down while McKay was off.
Interesting. You'd think it'd be the opposite.
Right.
That's
right. You never know.
Yeah.
The way they described it was that was the really fun part. And then the second part, which was more like taking the big messy bag of ideas and starting to lay out, okay, what's going to happen in each scene, was very difficult and not particularly enjoyable. But once they had done that, they could start sort of drafting the actual script as it was. And then that was a really enjoyable part as well. And I think one of the strengths that they had here was that, normally when you're writing a script, you may imagine, okay, I wonder what it would sound like when my actor is going to deliver this line, and sort of picture it in your head. And I think the strength that they had here was that they had the star of the movie in the room. And so they could write a line for Ron Burgundy and then hear Ron Burgundy deliver the line. And then they could, sort of and have a better assessment of, does this line work for us or not? So I think that helped a lot too.
And you say he kind of got his inspiration, or Will got his inspiration for Ron from this guy, Mort Krim. What a great name. Did it take him a while to get that character down?
It didn't sound like it, but I think the interesting thing that happened, so I think Mort Krim was more like the inspiration, like the kickoff idea.
Yeah.
But Ferrell was telling me that a number of times he had newscasters from that era approach him and say, well, obviously this movie is based on me, right? And he would tell them, well, not exactly,
Right.
or based on the era, but newscasters kept being convinced that Will Ferrell was just channeling and playing them specifically.
That the egos are still very real even today. Yeah, he reminds me of a lot of newscasters that I grew up with in New York, and I know that they kind of use some of them as consultants, right? But some of the newscasters, when they found out that it wasn't like a serious thing, kind of backed out.
Yeah, they had spoken to, I think, Chuck Scarborough, who's a local news legend, and I think once he realized, oh, this is not like a serious drama about
Bill Beutel and Chuck Scarborough were the big New York ones. Yeah,
I think he backed out. But then other newscasters of the era that they spoke to, they would tell them, they sort of described the movie to them, and their response was, oh, it was actually much crazier than how you have it in the movies. One of the stories that they came across was a local newscaster who was in a bar and had lost track of the time, and ended up missing the newscast for the day, and called in and reported the news like from the bar over the phone. And events like the pool party that the movie begins with, those were even more drunken and raucous and over the top than the movie depicts. So there it sounds like there is a kind of perverse realism in here of depicting just how over the top this whole era felt like.
this is probably an inside baseball question, but I'm just curious. What came first? Did you sell this book idea and then secure all these interviews with these? Because in some ways, this book can't work unless you're able to get access to the players. How did you sell a book when you couldn't guarantee that you would get Will Ferrell to talk to you?
It's always a little bit of not a magic trick. It's always a little bit of a challenge. Dance. Yeah. So all I can promise, generally speaking, is I'm going to do my best to line up an interview. Yeah. And frankly, I think that the book would work just fine even if I hadn't spoken to them. It wouldn't be quite as rich, but I find that I often get some of the best and most interesting and newest material from crew members. Right. Because they're not the ones who've often given lots of interviews before. So their stories are fresher and less available. But yeah, it ended up taking a while to line up the interviews. It took about a year to line up the interview with Adam McKay and about a year and a half to line up the interview with Will Ferrell. But they were both really gracious, and I really appreciated them taking the time to speak with me. And I think maybe this is me just being optimistic, but I think it was fun for them to get to talk about the process of making this movie. I think especially talking about the writing aspect, which, I went back through all the interviews that they have done in the past, and it hadn't come up all that often. So I think maybe that part especially felt a bit fresh.
Do you think they felt surprised that of all the movies they did, this is the one you're picking?
I think it's the obvious choice among their movies, but I don't know exactly how they might feel about that.
Well, just in closing here, we talked about the enduring power of this book, why do I say book? The book, hopefully too, but we talk about the enduring power of this movie. You have a few points, and you've made them earlier, sort of it's a feminist movie. It speaks to, toxic masculinity, but you also say that it's a movie that makes us feel superior to the past. Can you talk a little bit about that? I thought that was a really interesting idea.
Yeah, I think it's pretty elemental to the movie that it's a movie made in 2004, but set in the 1970s, because I think it allows us, or let me specifically say, it allows the audience of 2004 to feel like it's okay to laugh at what's going on here, right? What the movie, as I understand it, is essentially saying is, this is what it was like in the bad old days. This is how people used to behave. Isn't it bad, but also kind of funny to see how they would comport themselves in these situations? So, I think if this was a 2004 movie set in 2004, where the characters were doing all the same things, I think audiences would have felt a lot ickier about it, or felt like this is too realistic. Like I can't allow myself to laugh at something that's this unpleasant. So I think setting it in the 1970s, which already has a kind of cultural reputation as a time when people didn't behave well, didn't dress well, drove ugly cars, right? Like all of that stuff sort of feeds into that. I think that the kind of challenge or the change, I'm always interested in the ways in which the ways that we watch specific movies kind of change over time. I think that it's harder to look at this movie now and have that same kind of easy assumption of like, oh, this is only how people used to behave and not how they currently behave, right? Like after 4 years of having a misogynist like Donald Trump as president, it's very difficult to say, oh yeah, no one does that anymore.
Nobody like that anymore. Yeah,
So
I know.
I think in some ways, right, that maybe challenges some of the assumptions of the movie. In some ways, I think it enriches it because the thing that it's depicting is still very present, right? It's still very real. It's still very much a thing that people are struggling with. And so it feels like Anchorman kind of got to a crucial part of our contemporary cultural and societal conversation a bit ahead of the rest of us.
Well, it's a great book. It's called Kind of a Big Deal, How Anchorman Stayed Classy and Became the Most Iconic Comedy of the 21st Century. Saul Austerlitz, thank you so much for talking about the book with us and writing this great book.
Thanks so much. This was really a pleasure.
Right About Now is a Strike Fire production with theme music by Elijah Small. If you want to find out more about Right About Now, go to rightaboutnowmedia.com. Also, you can subscribe to my Substack, which is called Small Talk. Look for it on substack.com. Until we meet again, this is John Small, encouraging you to do the right thing.